So this is the first in a series of films that I want to make. The series is called Rethinking Existentialism. I'm writing a book at the moment called Rethinking Existentialism, and the idea is that each of these films will introduce the basic ideas of each of the chapters of the book as I write the book. So each film will only be about 10, maybe 15 minutes long, and is really intended as a kind of bite-sized introduction to the chapter, and together they'll make a good introduction to the book. The book itself is focused on French existentialism, what I consider to be the core of classical existentialism. The works in the 1940s and early 1950s of Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, and to some extent Frantz Fanon. But the book will also kind of set their thought in its context by considering the relationships between what they have to say and the works of Albert Camus and Maurice Merleau-Ponty and slightly earlier works of Sigmund Freud. So, as this is the first film and the first chapter of the book, the obvious question to ask is, what is existentialism? And so that's the title of this film, and it's the title of the chapter too. So yeah, what is existentialism? That's a very good question. I'm glad I asked that question, because if you pick up an introductory book or an introductory article or an encyclopedia article or something like that about existentialism, you might find frustratingly that it doesn't answer that question. It's quite common for introductory works on existentialism to just list a bunch of thinkers. They say, oh, it's the works of Kierkegaard and maybe Nietzsche, maybe Heidegger, Sartre, Beauvoir, maybe Camus, and maybe to pick out a bunch of issues that they all discussed, such as freedom or the significance of death and mortality, or the origins of moral values, or something like that. And it can be very hard to see what makes these people existentialists and what makes those theories, existentialist theories that are discussed in these works. It comes to look rather like a kind of ragbag of closely related thoughts by thinkers who influenced one another, but with no clear sense of unity, no clear sense of why those people and those thoughts are being categorized together in this way. And as a result, no clear definition of what existentialism really is. Now, I think that this has happened for historical reasons. For a long time in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century, in English-speaking universities in the USA and North America more generally, and in the UK, it was really taboo to talk about European philosophy. It was considered not really to be philosophy, not to be well thought out, rigorous, well argued, well considered work. And so it's in that context that people like Robert Solomon and Walter Kaufmann wrote introductions to what they called existentialism, which covered over a wide range of European thinkers, novelists, playwrights, as well as poets, as well as philosophers. And both Kaufmann and Solomon edited anthologies of extracts from the works of the people that they were discussing in their introductory books. And this is what formed the kind of core curriculum under the name of existentialism for thousands and thousands of students for years on end. And this, as I say, was just a way of getting this literature discussed in university departments, in philosophy departments, where it was considered not to be very good philosophy. And it's on the basis of those kind of collections of extracts that people come to look at existentialism and try and define what it is, and can't see much in common between all these people that have been categorized together in this way, and as a result tend to despair of ever giving a definition of existentialism, even sometimes telling you that the idea of defining existentialism is itself anathema to existentialism, right? There's something un-existentialist about the idea that you could even define what it is to make that makes something an existentialist theory. I think this is a mistake. I think this is an accident of history, an accident of the politics of academia in the English-speaking world in the second half of the 20th century. I think that Solomon and Kaufman have done us a great service in bringing that European literature into the curriculum, despite the opposition that they faced in doing so. But one of the side effects of the way they did it, and they used the word existentialism because it had such an appeal to students, but one of the side effects of doing it is that we've kind of lost sight of what really is or ever was the core of existentialism, I think. And so that's one of the things I want to rethink in this book. Because I think that actually the word is unusual in the history of philosophy in that it gets a clear definition pretty much as soon as it's even coined as a word, right? So the word was coined sometime probably around 1942, 1943, it seems, and it was used to label a kind of movement among philosophers who would talk about human existence in a certain kind of a way, who would use the word existential in a certain kind of way. And they would use that word to mean, to refer to the kind of existence that human beings have, the kind of way that we are, the kind of way that we live. And that's different from the kind of existence, as we would ordinarily use the word in English, the kind of existence of chairs and tables and rocks and planets and plants and rainbows and cats and dogs. Those all don't exist in this technical sense of the word, they just are. This is the use of the word existence, which really traces back to Martin Heidegger. In his book Being and Time in 1927, and began to influence French and German thought quite rapidly across the 1930s. But it gets its clear definition in 1945. What happens in 1945 at the end of the Second World War is that Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre decide to take on the word existentialism and use it as a kind of, basically as a kind of brand name for their philosophy. And so they quite deliberately go on what Beauvoir describes in her autobiography as the existentialist offensive. They publish lots of articles and other works. They give public lectures, and they keep using the word existentialism and defining it and giving it a precise meaning, which is the meaning of their own philosophy. And so, for this reason, I want to say that that's where we should start when we rethink existentialism. We should start with the idea that existentialism is as it was defined to be by the people who first gave it a clear definition. It is what Sartre and Beauvoir said it was in 1945 during the existentialist offensive. Now, this is slightly complicated by the fact that they didn't actually quite agree with each other. So they both used the same language, they used the same phrase, in fact, and the key phrase here is the phrase existence precedes essence. Right? That's how Sartre defines it in his lecture Existentialism is a Humanism, which was delivered in October 1945 and was subsequently published as a little book and has become very, very widely read all over the world ever since. It's also how Simone de Beauvoir defines it in her essay Existentialism and Popular Wisdom, which was published in October or November, I'm not sure, 1945 in Les Temps modernes, Modern Times, which was the a journal, a kind of literary and cultural review that Sartre and Beauvoir, with other people, including Merleau-Ponty, set up in 1945 as part of the existentialist offensive. So they both define existentialism in that way. Existence precedes essence. But they disagree on exactly what that means. And so one part of the book, one theme through my book, is going to be tracing exactly what that disagreement is, and how the disagreement gets resolved between them. But before I talk about that, I'll say a bit more about what they mean by what they both mean by the phrase existence precedes essence. And this, I guess, is slightly unclear because the word essence can mean different things. So in the way in which they're using the term, I think what they mean is what Aristotle meant when he talked about the essence of particular individuals. So the essence of an object or a thing, in this Aristotelian sense, is the principle of organization, right, that explains why it does what it does. Okay, so it's what it is that explains how the object kind of has the effects that it has in the world, by explaining how its various parts are organized and why its various parts are organized together in the way that they are. So as an example, you might think that the essence of a house, in this sense of essence, is that it's a shelter for living in, right? And because it's a shelter for living in, well, it has parts like walls and a roof and places to sleep and places to cook and places to eat. And that these are all organized in such a way as to keep the rain out and the wind out and to keep it as warm as possible and so on. And why does it do all those things? Why does it have its various parts that it has that are organized in that way so that it serves that purpose? Well, because it's a shelter for living in. That's why. That's the essence of a house. So in their view that for human beings, existence precedes essence, what Beauvoir and Sartre are trying to say is that they think that for the individual human being, there is no single organizing principle that explains why they behave the way they do, why they organize themselves and their lives the way that they do. Okay, so there is no inbuilt character, there's no personality, they think, to an individual that's just innate and just develops from birth according to causal interactions with the world. And similarly, for that reason, they think there are no collective characteristics either, because if there's no innate characteristics of an individual, then there can't be any innate characteristics of a particular group of individuals. So there's no innate essential characteristics of gender, for example. There are no essential characteristics that mark out men and women as different. And similarly, there are no essential characteristics of different ethnic groups. Right? Different people from different ethnic backgrounds are not essentially different on the existentialist picture, because they can't be, because nobody has any inbuilt essential properties. Instead, on their view, what makes each individual behave the way they do is a set of projects. That's their word for it. A set of projects that the individual is pursuing. And what that really comes down to, I think, is a set of values that the individual endorses and pursues in action. Okay, so that's, I mean, we're going to explore this idea in a lot more detail across the rest of the films. So I realise it's a bit sketchy right there, but that's the basic idea, that the reason that one way of thinking of it is this, that the character that an individual person has, that you have, is not something you're born with or something that you, as it were, can't help, but it's really comes down to a set of values that organise and shape the way you see the world, and that they are your values and that you can change those values. That's the idea. It's a pretty controversial idea, and there's an important question of how far it goes, but that is the basic idea of existentialism. Now, two more points. One is that, as I say, Sartre and Beauvoir disagree on exactly what that means in 1945. By 1952, I think they agree. And what's happened over that time is that Sartre has come around to Beauvoir's way of thinking. So in 1945, Beauvoir's view all along, I think, is that the values that and the projects that you pursue become habituated. They become, to use Merleau-Ponty's word, sedimented. That is, the influence that they have over your behaviour becomes stronger and more difficult to overcome as time goes on. The more you act on a particular value, the more you act on a way of seeing the world, the more it just becomes deeply ingrained in your outlook. And that's not to say, for Beauvoir, that it can't be overcome, but to say that it can't simply be abandoned. You can't just change your mind and stop seeing the world the way you have done for years and years on end, right? Sartre, on the other hand, thinks that you can. On Sartre's picture in 1945, in fact in 1943, in Being and Nothingness, that's exactly what you can do. That's exactly the idea. And that's what he calls radical freedom, that you can just overthrow at any time any aspect of your worldview, that, no matter how long it's been something that you know has been defining who you are. He thinks that people don't do that, and he thinks they don't do that because it comes at a heavy price. It's a very difficult thing to do, to persuade yourself to do, but there's no kind of inbuilt structure of human existence that actually makes it difficult. Right? There's nothing that there's no way in which those values have become embedded for Sartre in 1945. By 1952, I think he's changed his mind and is seeing the world the way Beauvoir does. But that's something I'll talk about more in this series of films. And the second point is that existentialism isn't only a theory of behavior and motivation. It isn't only a theory of what it is to be human. It's also an ethical theory. In fact, it's their concern, in many ways, Beauvoir and Sartre are very traditional Socratic philosophers. They think that the fundamental question of philosophy is how one should live. Right? It's how to live. And that's the question of ethics. And so because they think that that's the basic question of philosophy, but they also stand in a very long-standing philosophical tradition of thinking that the way to answer that question is through a concern with what human existence is. So how can you answer the question of how should we live? Well, first you need to understand what our kind of life is, right, before you can see what a good way to live is. And that's why they developed the particular theory of human motivation that they do, the theory that existence precedes essence. They want to use that as the basis of their ethics. In fact, that's exactly what they try to do. So later on in this series of talks, I'm going to talk about that, about the problems for their ethical outlook that are actually generated by their particular view of human existence, and about the ways in which they try to overcome those problems. And to give you a sneak preview, what I'm going to say is Sartre doesn't succeed in his attempt to overcome those problems, I think. But Beauvoir's argument, that's first published actually in 1944 in her short book Pyrrhus and Cineas, is much more promising in that regard, and situates existentialism in a tradition of Kantian ethics. So it turns out that the view that she's arguing for there is very similar to something that Immanuel Kant makes central to morality in his groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. But all of that is to come in later films. I hope this short introduction to the series has been useful, and goodbye.